Jim Morrison's death has remained one of rock's most puzzling stories. But what many people don't know is that before he passed, Ray Manzarek shared details and concerns that changed the way many look at that final chapter. From Jim's sudden decision to leave Los Angeles, to the strange events surrounding his time in Paris, to the one detail that Ray said never made sense, this story is filled with moments that still raise eyebrows today. Join us as we uncover the story Ray Manzarek tried to tell. Troubled childhood and early rebellions. Jim Morrison was born on December 8, 1943 in Melbourne, Florida. His father was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Navy, which meant the family moved often and lived under strict rules. This was not a relaxed, easygoing home. Discipline, duty, and respect for authority were important values in the Morrison household, and Jim did not always fit into that world. Because of his father's military career, Jim grew up in many different places across the United States. He had to change schools and neighborhoods again and again. This constant movement made it hard to form long-term friendships, but it also exposed him to different types of people and environments. Over time, this helped shape his sense of being an outsider, someone who observed life rather than simply going along with it. From a young age, Jim loved reading. He was drawn to books that many kids his age would not pick up. He read about mythology, philosophy, and classic literature. He became interested in big questions about life, death, and the nature of reality. He did not simply accept what adults told him. Instead, he questioned, challenged, and pushed back. This early curiosity later showed up in his lyrics and poetry. Death was a strong theme in Jim's imagination. One event, in particular, stayed with him his whole life. Jim claimed that, as a child, he saw a serious car crash on a highway in the desert. According to him, a truck full of Native American people had overturned, and bodies were lying on the road. He later said that the ghosts of these people entered him that day and never left. Whether this story happened exactly as he told it or was shaped over time does not really matter, as much as the fact that it became a key part of his personal story. For Jim, this memory was a turning point and a kind of spiritual shock. It fed his sense that the world was full of unseen forces, mystery, and pain. As he grew older, Jim started to rebel more openly. He did not get along well with authority figures, including teachers and sometimes his parents. He broke rules, tested boundaries, and refused to follow a simple path. Instead of planning a safe, stable career, he drifted toward art, writing, and eventually music. The seeds of his later persona were already there. Intelligent, intense, and drawn to darkness and beauty at the same time. After high school, Jim eventually made his way to Los Angeles and enrolled at UCLA's film school. There, he found a place where his interests finally had room to grow. UCLA Film School was a place filled with creative energy. Students were watching foreign movies, discussing new ideas, and dreaming about changing culture through art. Jim's focus at UCLA was not on mainstream Hollywood films. He was more interested in European directors, experimental cinema, and anything that pushed limits. At the same time, he was reading beat writers and modern poets. This mix of film, poetry, and philosophy helped shape his unique way of seeing the world. During this period, Jim was already writing poetry in notebooks. He carried his writing around, filling pages with images, thoughts, and lines that would later become song lyrics. However, he was shy about sharing this side of himself. He did not yet see himself as a performer. He was more comfortable watching, thinking, and writing quietly. Everything began to change when he met Ray Manzarek on Venice Beach. Both were film students at UCLA, and they recognized something in each other. They talked about music, philosophy, and the changing times. Ray asked Jim what he had been doing since graduation, and Jim mentioned he had been writing songs and poems. When Jim nervously sang a few lines from his notebook, Ray was stunned. he heard something powerful and original in Jim's words and voice. Ray insisted that Jim should sing in a band. This moment planted the first real seed for what would become The Doors. Once Jim agreed to try singing, his life took a dramatic turn. The shy, bookish poet began to step into a new role. At first, he was nervous on stage and sometimes turned his back to the audience. But as the band rehearsed more and began playing live shows, his confidence grew. Jim's style as a singer was different from most rock frontmen of the time. He did not just sing the words. He used his voice in a very free way, stretching, whispering, shouting, and improvising new lines in the middle of songs. His performances felt unpredictable and intense. He seemed to fall deeply into the music, as if entering another state of mind. People in the audiences were drawn to this energy, even when it made them uncomfortable. In these early performances, Jim learned that he could change the mood of a room with a single gesture or phrase. He could calm a crowd or inflame it. This was a powerful discovery for him. On stage, he was no longer the uncertain student. He became a commanding, mysterious figure. Out of this growth came the persona that would follow him for the rest of his short life. The Lizard King. The look developed along with the attitude. Jim wore tight leather pants, often went shirtless, and let his hair fall loose and wild. He moved on stage in a free and sometimes dangerous way, testing how far he could go. His presence was raw, intense, and hard to ignore. The thoughtful child who once read mythology alone had now stepped fully into the spotlight as the dark, charismatic poet of a new rock era. And just as Jim was becoming this powerful figure on stage, the band he formed with Ray and the others was about to break through and change everything. The Doors. After their meeting on Venice Beach, Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek started to seriously think about forming a band. Ray already had musical experience and a strong interest in blending rock with more complex sounds. Jim had the words, the ideas, and an unusual voice. They just needed the right people to complete the group. Ray's jazz band, the Rick and the Ravens, had already played around Los Angeles. But things really changed when drummer John Densmore joined. John had a background in jazz and world music, and he brought a sensitive, rhythmic style that could follow Jim's sudden changes in mood and tempo. Shortly after, guitarist Robbie Krieger came in. Robbie was not a typical rock guitarist. He had studied flamenco and played with a very melodic, sometimes spooky feel. Together, the four of them became The Doors. They made a key decision about their sound. Instead of having a traditional bass player, Ray played the bass parts on a keyboard bass with his left hand while using his right hand for organ and other keyboard lines. This choice gave The Doors a very special sound. Robbie's guitar was important, but it did not dominate the way it did in many other rock bands. Ray's organ and piano parts became the central musical layer, and Jim's voice and lyrics floated over the top. Right from the start, the chemistry between them was strong. Their music pulled from many places at once: blues, jazz, rock, classical, and Eastern sounds. Jim's dark, poetic lyrics blended with Robbie's haunting guitar lines, John's shifting rhythms, and Ray's swirling organ chords. When they played together, it felt like all their different influences joined into one unusual, powerful style. Before they became famous, The Doors spent long hours rehearsing in the Hollywood Hills and other small spaces. These were not light, casual practices. They played the same songs over and over, stretching them, changing them, and trying new ideas. Some rehearsals went on for hours, almost like long journeys through sound. Jim's writing style fit this process well. He often wrote alone, filling notebooks with poems, lines, and images. He could be quiet for long periods, then suddenly bring in a new set of words that changed a song completely. Sometimes he took older poems and reshaped them to fit the band's music. Other times, he improvised new lines on the spot during rehearsal, and the band worked around whatever he came up with. The band slowly moved into the heart of the Los Angeles music scene, especially along the Sunset Strip. The most important step was their residency at the Whiskey A Go Go, a famous club that hosted many rising bands. Playing there night after night helped the Doors develop their live act and gain a following. People started talking about them as something different and a little dangerous. It was during one of these shows at the Whiskey that Jim performed the extended Oedipal section of the end, adding long, disturbing lines about family, sex, and violence. The performance shocked many people in the club and upset the management. The Doors were fired from the Whiskey, but the moment also made them into legends. Word spread that the Doors were not just another rock band. They were something intense, unpredictable, and fearless. And as the band burned brighter on stage and in the studio, Jim's relationship with Pamela and his struggle with alcohol were about to pull him into even darker places. Jim and Pamela Corson. Pamela Corson was a young, red-haired art student from California when she met Jim Morrison in the mid-1960s. She was not famous, but she had a strong presence. Friends described her as sensitive, intense, and stylish. She loved art, poetry, and fashion, and she moved in the same kind of underground circles that Jim was beginning to explore as the Doors were rising. When Jim and Pam met, there was an instant pull between them. Jim saw in her someone who understood his artistic side and his need to live outside normal rules. Pamela, in turn, was drawn to Jim's mind, his wild energy, and his growing fame. Their connection was emotional, romantic, and creative all at once, which made it powerful but also unstable. Pamela influenced many parts of Jim's life. She helped shape his look, encouraging his long hair, his special clothing choices, and his more bohemian style. She loved unique clothes and often dressed in a way that stood out, and Jim picked up some of that flair. Over time, fans would see them as a striking pair, the dark, brooding rock poet and the fiery artistic partner by his side. On a deeper level, Pamela encouraged Jim to see himself as more than just a rock singer. She reminded him that he was a poet and an artist in a wider sense. She took his writing seriously, read his work, and shared her own tastes in literature and art. This support meant a lot to Jim, who often felt misunderstood by the public and the media. Jim and Pamela lived what many would call a bohemian lifestyle. They moved through Los Angeles in a blur of parties, music, art, and late nights. Their apartment life was far from calm. It was filled with visitors, noise, and strong emotions. They loved each other deeply, but they also fought often and intensely. They shared private jokes, read together, listened to music, and dreamed about a different kind of life. Pamela believed there was more to Jim than the rock star the world saw, and Jim trusted Pamela with parts of himself that he hid from others. This mix of love and conflict made their life together intense and exhausting. What they didn't know was that this search for a fresh start in Paris would lead straight into the most mysterious and tragic chapter of Jim's life: the slow spiral. In the early days of the Doors, Jim Morrison's drinking looked at first like a part of the usual rock scene. A few drinks before a show helped him loosen up and step into his wild, fearless stage persona. Alcohol gave him temporary courage. It helped him move from the shy poet who once turned his back to the crowd into the powerful frontman who could hold thousands of people in silence or spark them into chaos with just a line or a shout. Over time, Jim's drinking moved from occasional to constant. Whiskey became his regular choice, and it was often nearby, at home, in the studio, backstage, and in the bars he loved to visit. Drinking was no longer something that only happened before or after a performance. It became a daily pattern, woven into his routine. Jim Morrison was, at his core, an artist and a writer. His creativity came from deep thought, observation, and a strong inner world. When he was focused, he could produce powerful lyrics, haunting images, and intense performances. But alcohol began to twist that process. As his drinking increased, he started to miss studio sessions or arrive late. There were times when he would forget lyrics, even ones he had written himself. The band might be ready to record, but Jim would be in no condition to deliver his best work. This made the process stressful for everyone involved. Instead of flowing naturally, recording sessions turned into a struggle between Jim's talent and his drinking. His behavior became more unpredictable. On a good day, he would show up inspired, playful, and full of ideas. On a bad day, he might be withdrawn, angry, or completely out of control. People around him could not always tell which version of Jim they would get. This made planning difficult and left many friends and colleagues feeling uneasy. A big part of the damage came from the people he drank with. Jim had many drinking buddies, people who loved being around a famous rock star, especially when he was paying for drinks and drawing attention. They kept him out late, moving from bar to bar, talking, laughing, and arguing, but not creating much of lasting value. These people took his time and his energy, and they often kept him away from the quiet space he needed to write. Pamela lived with the daily reality of his alcohol abuse. She worried constantly about his health, his safety, and his future. His late-night disappearances, his unpredictable moods, and his careless behavior with other people all fed her anger and fear. Their fights often centered on his drinking. She wanted him to slow down, to come home earlier, and to avoid certain people. But Jim was not easy to control. He could be defensive, stubborn, and dismissive when confronted. The band members, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore, also felt the strain. They needed Jim to write, sing, and perform, but they never knew which version of Jim would arrive at a rehearsal, recording session, or concert. Sometimes he was brilliant, focused, and full of magic. On those days, the band felt unstoppable. Other times, he was drunk, distant, or hostile. On those days, they had to work around him, or even cover for him. And as this inner battle grew stronger, the public scandals, like the infamous Miami concert, only added more pressure and pushed him even further toward the edge. The 1969 Miami concert scandal. On March 1, 1969, the Doors were scheduled to play a concert at the Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami, Florida. The event was poorly planned from the start. The venue had been changed from a smaller theater to a large, converted airplane hangar-style space, and it was overcrowded. Thousands of fans packed in, and the atmosphere was hot, loud, and tense. Before Jim even stepped on stage, things were already going wrong. There were reports of flight delays, confusion about schedules, and chaotic organization backstage. By the time Morrison arrived, he had already been drinking heavily. He was annoyed, tired, and frustrated with everything: the industry, the audience's expectations, and his own growing legend. When the Doors started playing, it quickly became clear that this would not be a normal concert. Jim was not focused on singing the songs cleanly. He stopped and started, provoked the band, and turned his attention more and more to the crowd. He spoke, shouted, and rambled into the microphone, questioning the nature of performance and accusing the audience of wanting only mindless entertainment. He taunted the crowd, teasing them, daring them to react. Instead of keeping a clear boundary between the stage and the audience, he tried to break it down. He called on people to come closer, to join in, to stop just watching and start participating. As his words became more aggressive and more chaotic, the audience responded with equal energy. Fans surged toward the stage, some climbing up, others pushing forward. Security had trouble containing the movement. The scene began to feel less like a concert and more like a near riot. The Miami concert had serious consequences for the Doors and for Jim personally. Once the scandal hit the news, politicians, religious groups, and local leaders around the United States began to speak out against the band. Promoters grew nervous. Some were pressured to cancel upcoming shows. Others pulled out on their own to avoid controversy. As a result, many Doors concerts were canceled across the country. This was a major blow to the band. Live shows were not only a way to connect with fans, they were also a huge part of their income. With tours falling apart, their financial situation became unstable. The band's reputation also took a hit. Some fans stayed loyal, but others were scared off or turned away by the headlines. All of this weight, the scandal, the canceled shows, the court case, would follow Jim into his final years and play a role in his growing desire to escape to Paris and start over. His death in Paris. Before Paris, there was L.A. Woman. That album was the Doors' big return after the Miami scandal and all the chaos that followed. The band was recording in their own rehearsal space, a more relaxed setting than a formal studio. The music had a raw, bluesy feel, and Jim's voice sounded older and rougher, but still powerful. In Paris, Jim tried to live a quieter life with Pamela, away from the constant attention of American media and the pressure of being Jim Morrison of the Doors. He could walk the streets without being recognized as often. He spent time visiting cafes, cinemas, and bookshops, and he walked a lot through the old neighborhoods. On the night of July 3, 1971, Jim Morrison died in the Paris apartment he shared with Pamela on Rue Beautreillis. The exact details of that night remain unclear and are still debated. The official story, based largely on Pamela's account, is that Jim had not been feeling well. At some point during the night or early morning, he decided to take a bath. Pamela said she fell asleep and later woke up to find Jim unresponsive in the bathtub. Emergency services were called, but it was too late. Jim Morrison was declared dead at the age of 27. The death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. No autopsy was performed. Under French law at the time, if there were no clear signs of foul play, an autopsy was not always required. The authorities treated the case as sad but straightforward, and they closed it quickly. Back in the United States, the band members were stunned when they heard the news. At first, Ray did not believe it. There had been death rumors about Jim before, and Jim himself once joked about rumors of my death being exaggerated. This time, though, the calls kept coming, and it quickly became clear that this was not just gossip. The band's manager flew to Paris to handle things. Within a few days, Jim Morrison was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, a historic cemetery in Paris where many famous artists and writers are laid to rest. The funeral was small and quiet, with only a handful of people present. There was no large public event, no crowds, and almost no press. And as Ray later began to speak more openly about what he knew and what he didn't know, his words would shape a very different way of looking at Jim Morrison's death and what might really have happened. Ray Manzarek reveals the truth. For Ray Manzarek, the last time he saw Jim Morrison is frozen in his mind. The L.A. Woman sessions. The band was close to finishing the album. The songs were recorded, the energy was strong, and they were working through the final touches. In Ray's words, the very last thing Jim ever recorded with the Doors was that soft, eerie whisper on Riders on the Storm. It was the final vocal line he laid down in a studio, and as far as Ray knew, the last time Jim ever sang on record. Right after doing that part, Jim announced he was going to Paris. He said Pamela had already gone ahead, found an apartment, and set everything up. Jim told the others they were almost done anyway. The mixes sounded great, and they should just finish the rest without him. That alone was strange. Normally, Jim liked to come in and hear the final mixes, to listen to the finished album as a whole. At the time, the band accepted his decision. Ray even thought it was a good idea. Paris meant a break from the drinking buddies, the hangers-on, and the constant trouble in Los Angeles. Jim seemed excited about going, about walking away from the chaos, and maybe becoming a poet again, not just a rock star. After Jim settled in Paris with Pamela, there was at least one important phone call that Ray later talked about. though it was actually between Jim and drummer John Densmore. By then, L.A. Woman had been released, and the album was doing very well. Critics liked it, fans were responding, and it felt like the Doors were truly back after a difficult period. Jim called John from Paris to ask how the record was doing. When John told him it was racing up the charts and people loved it, Jim was thrilled. He sounded excited and proud. On that call, Jim said something that surprised some people later. He talked about going back on tour. He said he couldn't wait to play the L.A. Woman songs live, tracks like L.A. Woman and Riders on the Storm, which they had never really taken on the road. When the news first reached Ray that Jim Morrison was dead, he simply did not believe it. There had been rumors of Jim's death before, false alarms that spread through parties or scenes and then turned out to be untrue. Once, someone even ran in, saying Jim had died in a car crash, only for Jim to walk in a few minutes later, laughing and quoting the famous line, "Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated." So when Ray got that early morning phone call saying Jim was dead in Paris, his first reaction was to treat it like another rumor. He brushed it off, thinking it was just more drama, more confusion around a man whose life drew extreme stories. But this time, it was different. Their manager said he was flying to Paris to check. A few days later, another call came. The manager said, "We just buried Jim Morrison." That was the moment it hit Ray. The joke was over. There was no sudden entrance from Jim this time. The reality sank in. His friend, his singer, his creative partner was gone. Ray was crushed. It wasn't just the loss of a bandmate. It was the loss of someone he had walked with from quiet student days on Venice Beach to global fame, someone whose mind and soul he understood as deeply as anyone could. Beyond the mystery, there was deep personal pain. Ray often spoke of his relationship with Jim as a kind of artistic partnership built on two sides of one coin. In his view, Jim was the Dionysian force, wild, emotional, impulsive, creative, and destructive at the same time. Ray saw himself as the Apollonian side, structured, disciplined, and focused on form and musical order. Together, they made The Doors what it was. Losing Jim meant losing that balance. It meant no more late-night talks about poetry and philosophy, no more crazy concerts where anything could happen, and no more hours in the studio trying to turn raw ideas into finished songs. For Ray, it was like losing a brother. In the years after Jim's death, Ray kept reminding people that Jim Morrison was not just a troublemaker or a drunk rock star. He pushed back against the shallow image that the media often used. To Ray, Jim was a serious artist, a poet who carried heavy questions about life and death inside him, and a fragile, complex human being who struggled with fame, addiction, and his own inner storms. And while Ray's doubts about the way Jim died will probably never be fully answered, his memories and words keep that last chapter alive as something more than a simple line in a history book, hinting that there was always more to Jim's story than what the world was allowed to see. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment about what part of Jim's story fascinates you the most.